Good evening. I'm Deborah Stone. I'm editor of the Jewish Independent, and I'd like to welcome you all to our event on Syria. What's happened and what's about to happen. Um, I'll begin, as we always do in Australia, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet. For me, that's the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And my husband has just taken the dogs for a walk, so now you should be able to hear me. But more importantly, you will be able to hear Hagai Segal and Dror Doron, who are the two experts who we are very lucky to have got together at very short notice to talk to us. We have all had our eyes off the ball on Syria for the past, well, year at least. There's been a lot to look at in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in the diaspora too, in terms of the rise in anti-Semitism. So I think it's all come at us with a bit of a shock to find a massive regime change in Syria. So we are all very keen to understand a little about what we're dealing with and what it means for the region, obviously for Israel in particular, but also more broadly for the balance of power in the Middle East. You all have the opportunity to ask questions. I'll begin by asking some questions, but you will see on your screens there is a Q&A. You can write your questions in there. And before you do, please read the questions that are already there. If there's one you like, vote it up. If there's one similar to the one you're already asking, don't ask it. And hopefully that will ensure that we use the hour that we have with Dror and Hagai in the most effective way possible. Brief bios, I hope you have all had a chance to read a little bit about Hagai and Dror, but they are both very highly qualified people who we're very lucky to have got at a time where everybody wants to speak to them. Hagai's a professor from New York University. He's a specialist in the geopolitics of the Middle East and in terrorism and counterterrorism. Dror is now based in Australia, where he's a senior advisor at United Against Nuclear Iran, and he served for 17 years in the Israeli government. So let's get going. And I think before we start talking about what the future looks like, we need a bit of an understanding of what Syria was like before this weekend. So Bashar al-Assad has been president of Syria for 24 years. What has that meant for the country? What was everything like before we saw this massive revolution? Hagai, can you give us a brief background on?
Oh, good morning, Deborah. Thank you. Good morning from London, everyone. Good evening to you all in Australia. Um, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and to Jewish Independent for inviting me to participate in this event today. Um, we've had an Assad regime running Syria for 54 years, the father and the son. And Bashar al-Assad was famous for his Machiavellian brutality. Um, Believe it or not, he used to, every year on annual parades, have female soldiers bite the heads off live snakes in front of him in order to demonstrate their loyalty to the state. Now, think about the scale to which there is a repressive regime that is the case. When his son took over in 2000, and remember that he had been an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor in London, he'd never intended to be a world leader. It was his brother who was supposed to be the next president of Syria, but he was killed in a car crash. Suddenly, this young man gets recalled, and because he, lived in London, he spoke fluent English. There was an assumption in the West that he was going to be quite a moderate leader. And if you think about in 2000 when he came to power, things were quite relaxed. But what then happens in the next few years? We have the failure of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the outbreak of the Second Intifada, 9/11, the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, and suddenly we're in a very, very different situation on the ground in Syria. And very quickly, and we've seen in the last few days all the details about the nature of the government and its repression with the prisons, is that he went very much back to the brutal state of his father. What's also really important to remember is that he comes from the Alawite minority. They only represent around 10% of the population of Syria. They are a Mohammedan group, which is from the Shia branch of Islam, where the vast majority of people in Syria are Sunni. And that's hugely important in why they created this relationship with Iran, but also the fear that if they ever fell, they would get slaughtered by Sunnis. And that's why in the last few days, the HTS grouping and others with around them seem at pains to be kind of saying that, this is not what's going to happen, and that they're a good, they're a safe pair of hands. Very briefly, I'm just going to show a couple of maps because I also just want to give some perspective on this. One of the things that I think is key to understand what's going on is that is Syria going to exist again? And what is there such a thing as Syria? This is a map from 1851 of the notion of Greater Syria, which you'll see includes everything that is today Israel, Jordan, bits of Iraq, bits of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. So this idea of Syria is quite a modern idea. This is what it looked like when we had Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh. And remember, they controlled huge swathes of Syria and Iraq. And then this was during the a few years after the Arab Spring had started. At this point, Syria doesn't, there's almost no Syria left, almost no Iraq left. But what's really important is when we get to this, and this is kind of the status quo we've had in the last few years. You see on the kind of the dark blue areas on the left is where the Syrian government controls Syria. The green on the right is where the Iraqi government controls Iraq. But all the other areas are either run by rebels or have been uncontrolled. And so what we've actually had is a situation where we haven't really had the idea of Syria as a single unitary state for quite a while. So much so that in the top right-hand corner there, the area in purple you see on the left, the Kurds actually have basically declared a semi-autonomous, not a state, but basically their own entity within Syria. And now today, that is under attack. And one of the most important things about what we're going to talk about today is, from my perspective, is understanding the role of Turkey. Turkey has been supporting the Assad regime until now. They realized that rebels they support could overthrow it. But their big interest in Syria is not actually the overthrow of the regime, it's the defeat of the Turks. This area you see on the right in the top, in the northeast of Syria, the purple, which you see is broken up by those two bits of yellow, that is run by the Kurds. The Turks are deeply worried about the Kurds creating a state. This is something historically that Turkey has seen as its greatest existential threat. And as you see there, and this is just from yesterday, HTS have already now attacked and taken some of the cities that the Kurds are controlling. So a huge dynamic today is not just about who is controlling the fall of the regime, but actually who is going to control Syria, and whether we're talking about one Syria or whether we're going to be talking about multiple Syrias, which all might be causing different stories and different dynamics and different problems. And this, as we're going to both, I'm sure, talk about in detail today, is one of the reasons why Israel has taken such dramatic action in the last few days. There's so many uncertainties. There's so many ways this could go in the negative direction. Israel has just made the decision to basically take out the entire previous Syrian military, so that whether things go good, bad, or in between, Israel has basically taken away the capacity of anybody to quickly restart a Syrian army.
Well, did you want to add anything to that?
Again? Can you repeat the question?
Did you want to add anything to that, just in terms of the starting point for the revolution?
Yeah, I think what Hagai said is 100% right. There is one definition that Syria should fall into. It's not a state, it's not a country, it's an arena where multiple forces, regional forces and international forces are fighting for hegemony, for control. Today it's very obvious that the Turks are very active, but we had Iranians, we had Russians, we had Saudis, Qataris, Jordanians, Israel, the United States with its coalition was operating in Syria. So Syria, over the past 14 years, has become an arena for multiple forces fighting each other. And it was a very disputed country for quite a long time. So this is the starting point. And we haven't had a normal Syrian state for more than a decade by now. And I totally agree with Hagai. It will take some time to see what will become from Syria from now on, because HTS, that's basically Al-Qaeda, supported by a radical or Islamist regime, both in Qatar and Turkey, and they try to downplay their Al-Qaeda affiliation, but it's pretty much there. Iran is not going to give up its very critical land crossover from Iraq into Lebanon, so Iran is still in the game. Will probably shake the dust off and will take some action in the future. So it's a very sensitive and a very fluid situation that we are entering into.
Let's talk a little bit about HTS. How much control do they now have over the country, and what will it look like in the areas where they have control?
I think I will start with, we already have an example of what an HTS regime looks like. For the past 5 years, HTS practically controlled an area in Syria, the Idlib province in the northern western part of Syria, close to the Turkish border. They've established an entity there, and it wasn't a liberal democracy. Okay, it was a radical Islamist regime, brutally eliminating all of its internal rivals, imposing Islam on the population, radical Islam, pretty much in the way that we saw coming out from Al-Qaeda, from Daesh, ISIS, and other radical Islamists. And that is the nature of HTS. Now, they took over practically all of Syria, except of the Turkish lands, of the Kurdish areas of control in the northern part. They practically have control over the majority of Syria. Whether they will rerun their Idlib kind of regime, radical Islamist, very unliberal, very intolerant, that's a possibility. They declare, their leader, Jolani, declared just the other day that they will try to show some kind of tolerance to other minorities or other ethnics in Syria. We should remember there are still Alawites, there are Druze, there are Kurds, there are all kinds of Christians minority, Assyrian, and so on. And HTS is going now to have to handle this mosaic of different groups in Syria, and not something their natural nature of the group is something that they're used to do.
And just to add to that, it's very interesting that they've been going out the way in the last few days to say things like, we're not going to impose women's dress codes, we're going to have tolerance. But, as Dror mentioned, this is not what they have been doing for the last few years in the part of Syria that they've been running. And I think what is going to be very interesting is if they indeed do establish some, more tolerant, less extreme regime, which undoubtedly is going to be to try and ensure that they're accepted by the international community, the point to which that is challenged. And I think there's two key things. I think a really interesting point of comparison here is Egypt. Remember that we had a democracy in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, run by deliberately setting up a new party, saying that they're much less religious than they used to be, being elected in a very, positive atmosphere where everyone's really excited where everything was going. And within a year, the protesters who'd overthrown Mubarak were now demanding the overthrow of what was very quickly becoming a radical Islamist entity. And then we're back to, military dictatorship in Egypt. Even worse is the situation that happened in Libya. So are they basically going to, do the nice thing and then basically run in elections and make the case for an Islamic entity? And then when they win that election, if that's what happens, they then are able to impose a much more austere Islamic regime because they've got an electoral mandate to do it. And this is the challenge of, this idea that the West is going to support democracy in Syria, and isn't it wonderful everyone's going to vote? That doesn't necessarily bring about outcomes that those Western governments and those Western actors support. At the same time, we cannot underestimate the consequences of the civil war that has been going on since 2011. You know, it is estimated that 70% of the population of Syria are internally and externally displaced, while up to three-quarters of the buildings are destroyed or damaged. This is a country that just desperately needs to go back to its own feet. And one of the rebel leaders, when asked a couple of days ago, you know, about fighting Israel, said, we just don't want any more conflict. You know, Syrians just want some time off just to relax. So I think there's a lot of reasons why you know, we can see that there's going to be, in the short term, a lot of attempts to make things positive. The question is what's going to happen in the medium and long term. And you know, the points that Dror makes are very important. We need to be rightly cynical as to whether we're going to get the kind of state that maybe leaders in the West would desperately hope for, but there's very little history of in the Middle East.
Syrian people, all those people who have been celebrating the fall of Assad, do they want an Islamic regime?
Well, again, it depends what we mean by an Islamic regime, because, you know, I think, by the way, successful democracy in the Arab world will only exist when you blend Islam and local culture. One of the great failures of the United States in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other parts of the Middle East, is the complete failure to understand, A, tribes, people's familial relationships, and that people don't remember the point I made before about showing that map from 1851. Is that the idea of Syria, it was contrived in many ways by the British. The idea of Iraq certainly was contrived. If you look at the bottom of that Iraq-Syria border I showed earlier, it's a straight line because Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, the British and French administrators, drew it with a straight line with a ruler from the A of Acre to the K of Kirkuk in 1916. You know, what people identify in the Middle East is by their whether they're Sunni, whether they're Shia, whether they're within the sub-tribes and the sub-familial dynamics within that. They identify as whether they're by their religious identity within the relevant sect of Sunni or Shia or other Islam that they're a part of. Any successful state has got to reflect that. Remember, this is a part of the world where people are still God-fearing. You know, while recently here in the UK, we had a survey that found that now more than half the population don't believe in God. In the Arab world, people pray, you know, the vast majority of people still pray every day. They go to the mosque. That is where they get their moral guidance and their instruction. And any successful political system is going to have to balance the successes of modern politics while reflecting those values. So I think if we're sensible, we should embrace and allow an element of religion within politics. But that's different from, you know, whether it's an Islamist and certainly a jihadist regime.
And adding to that, I think Hagai mentioned earlier the Egyptian experience. In Egypt, in 2011, 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood took over power. They were Islamists. They merged religion with politics. They were thrown over by a Muslim general from the Egyptian military. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is a Muslim believer. He's not a secular person. Practically, there are no secular movements or there are no secularism in the Arab world. Everybody is Muslim. Either the difference is whether you're Muslim privately in your house, believe in God and pray, or if you're an Islamist, meaning that you are willing or your vision is to take Islam into the political level and establish a Muslim state. And Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was sure a Muslim, but he was not an Islamist, and he fought harshly against the Muslim Brotherhood, which are Islamists. And we go back to Syria today, everybody is Muslim. Everybody wants a Muslim state. I'm not sure everybody wants an Islamist state. And that's going to be the story of Syria the next day.
Let's talk a bit about what it means for the region. There's obviously been, this is a huge defeat for Iran. It makes an enormous difference to Iran. How's Iran going to respond to this?
I will take it with your permission, Hagai. I think Iran first lost a major ally. Syria is a crucial element in Iran's regional architecture, regional vision. It's bridging between Iraq and Lebanon, Hezbollah, the crown jewel of Iranian influence of in the region, the crown jewel proxy of Iran, was established in Syria by the Iranian ambassador in Damascus in the early 80s. Without the Syria background and the arena that Syria enabled Iran to deliver funds, trainings, Hezbollah is now isolated from the world. And that's a major blow for Iran. We should remember that Syria was also a major Arab country. Iran are Farsis. The fact that they had this very loyal connection with an Arab leader, with an Arab major country like Syria, first the father Hafez and then the son Bashar, meant a lot to Iran's image in the Arab world, in the region as all, that we can cooperate with Arabs. We are not only Farsis, we represent something wider than our ethnicity. And that is now gone. And the HTS openly declared, Jolani in his first words, said, the time of Iran meddling in Syria is over. And that's a clear message that those guys, which are radical Sunnis, which are traditionally in competition with the radical Shia represented in Iran, are putting a very meaningful wedge in the middle of the Iranian Shiite crescent that spreads from Tehran through Iraq, through Syria, all the way to the Mediterranean and Lebanon. This project, this vision is now practically gone. And Iran is going to try to save what it can, mainly trying to save Hezbollah. I think in the next few weeks and months, we should see immense efforts by the Iranian regime to save what they can from Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in a very low point historically after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, after the elimination of the vast majority of its military leadership. It's isolated from Iran. It cannot be rebuilt as easily as it was in 2006 after the last Lebanese war. And we should see major efforts coming from Iran trying to save, again, its flagship proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah. And it's going to be very interesting to see how it's going to be done because Israel is watching very carefully and we must probably try to foil any such Iranian attempt.
And just to build on Dror's point, I often explain to my students and those that I work with that, one of the biggest things to know in international relations is the law of unintended consequences. When Hamas attacked Israel just over a year ago on October 7, the main motivation for it was that Israel and the Saudis were about to do a normalization deal. And very much serving an Iranian agenda, Hamas wanted to do something which they knew by Israel invading Gaza afterwards, which they were always going to have to do if Hamas was even vaguely successful with its attack, was that it would force Palestine back to the forefront of the agenda. It would therefore weaken Arab states. It would make it very difficult then to deal with the Israelis, and it would embolden Iran. What they in Iran, their backers, never anticipated was that actually would be the beginning of the complete destruction of Iran's regional power and regional network. After 9/11 and after the US invaded Iraq, Iran looked at itself and said, we can't defend ourselves conventionally against the United States. The way we're going to defend ourselves is create such a complicated regional dynamic of proxies, armed groups from Yemen to Iraq to Syria to Gaza, that nobody was stupid enough to go to war with us because it will create a regional conflict. But what actually Hamas did was it broke that entire network. It created the regional conflict, which has now collapsed that proxy network. Now, I think we need to be cynical with Netanyahu, proudly saying, Israel has just destroyed the Iranian network. This, of course, was sadly done on the greatest intelligence failure in Israeli history with October 7. How much, Israel's history will judge this as being, how we judge the negative versus the positive. But certainly we're in a remarkably different place than we were just over a year ago. And Iran has now been dramatically geographically separated from these areas and these proxy networks. And, I just want to add to Dror's point about the Sunni Shia thing. Remember now that we might have a government, and again, this is the law of unintended consequences as well. we might have a government in Syria that might be problematic for Israel if it ends up being radical Islamic, if not jihadist, but it is at the same time guaranteed to be completely anti-Iranian. I want to remind you that one of Iran's worst enemies in the world was and is now becoming again the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, people who don't follow the Middle East or these issues think, well, they're both radical Islam. They must be best friends. No, one is radical Sunni and one is radical Shiite, and therefore they're in the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Many of you will not know that Iran directly worked with America after 9/11 to help them invade Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban because they both had a mutual enemy. Um, and this law of unintended consequences thing, Netanyahu never intended by, doing what Israel has done in Gaza and against Hezbollah in Lebanon, that it would bring a former Al Qaeda group to power in Syria, right? So this is the other thing we have to be concerned about when, to the first part of your question, Deborah, you're asking about where things are going. There's so many variables, there's so many uncertainties. We've got at least 7 different countries operating on the ground in Syria. And this is why, as I mentioned earlier, Israel's taken such dramatic military action in Syria in the last few days, with complete uncertainty who is going to run the country and whether they're going to be good, bad, terrible, or worse. Israel has said, look, let's just literally take out the entire Syrian army. For those of you who don't know, this is the largest military operation in Israeli history. Senior Israeli commanders have said things like, we thought we'd seen everything, and then we did this. And this is because of these uncertainties. So there's things that we can clearly clarify, but it could go in a number of 10 or 12 different directions as all of the pieces start to fall and the dust settles.
Do you think it was a smart move of Israel to take out the essentially Syria's capacity, given that we don't know who's going to be running the place and they're quite likely to be unfriendly, whoever they are?
I think what Israel was trying to do was trying to prevent a scenario that we've already seen in the Middle East, in the Libyan case. When Muammar Gaddafi was toppled down, he had immense military capabilities. Those capabilities were spread and splintered into the different factions in Libya and led to major destabilization of Northern Africa, affecting Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco, and so on. I think one of Israel's most geostrategical nightmare was the repetition of such a scenario in Syria, especially when you have chemical weapons still around in Syria, even though they gave up most of it, some was left. Israel could not have taken the risk of any kind of the scenario happening in Libya repeating itself in Syria. And I think it was a very difficult decision, but a necessary one, because Israel right now is already being blamed behind the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Like Hagai said, nobody in Israel even imagined to do that. And it was just an unintentional sequence of events. Nevertheless, the risk it poses forced Israel to take an action now, a bit late, but never too late, to prevent the fall of those very dangerous capabilities to the hands of potentially radical jihadist Islamists, which we must say, at the moment, they do have the upper hand in Syria.
Yeah, and Dror's point about Libya is, I think, really important, which is not only at the time, we're talking back in 2010, 2011, did it massively destabilize all of its regional neighbors, all these weapons suddenly pouring into jihadists in the Sinai. We nearly had an Al-Qaeda affiliate taking Mali. We've had issues in Chad, but I also want to remind you that a decade later, in the states directly below those states across the Sahel, we've had 5 states next to each other that have not just one, but multiple military coups. What we've had is the leakage and the spread of this instability and the consequences of this weapons falling into different hands, which is now causing a continent in the top third of the African continent. And so if you take out Syria's military and also remember, by the way, that why hasn't it maybe got kind of the headlines? I was asked on the BBC radio yesterday, why is it that, this seems to be being tacitly accepted by the international community? Well, first of all, because they've got the same concerns, But the other reason is because the vast majority of what Israel here has been completely deserted by the Syrian army. I mean, it's not that Israel's killed hundreds or thousands of Syrian soldiers. This is an army that is evaporated and disappeared. 5,000 Syrian soldiers the other day crossed the Iraqi border and very happily surrendered themselves. So what we've got is, we've no idea who wants to run the Syrian army. In the future, we're going to take it out. And by the way, the other part of your question is, well, what happens if we end up having a Syria that is good and that we want to be strong? Well, then America and the international community will then rearm them. But that's a far better choice than the current capability falling into an army that nobody wants to be armed.
It seems quite unlikely that there's going to be a regime in Syria that's going to be friendly to Israel.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the basic sentiment of the Syrians over the past 50 years under the Assad regime was that Syria and Israel are mortal enemies. Syria fought numerous wars against Israel, and we can only imagine what was taught to children in the Syrian education system. And yes, I think the Syrian public is not in a position to accept any kind of peace agreement with Israel. And the most we can hope for is the continuation of the ceasefire agreement from 1973, the last war that was fought between the two countries, and the gradual de-escalation of the tensions over years. But I think Israel will need to be on its toes for quite a period of time in the next years.
Will having
Yeah.
the kind of chaos and potential control of HTS that we have in Syria further undermine Hezbollah?
Yeah, look, as I say, Iran is very much an enemy of HTS. Now, that doesn't mean they're a friend of Israel, right? Any student in the Middle East knows that the idea that my enemy's enemy is my friend is way too simplistic in the Middle East. Actually, my enemy's enemy is my next worst enemy, and we might be more problematic than my current enemy. And this is my point about the law of unintended consequences. Israel and America have repeatedly in the past pursued far too simplistic policy, thinking that they wanted one thing, only to realize they needed to have looked more moves ahead. Think about the fact that Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 to kick out the PLO, but that action created Hezbollah, which caused them way problems more than the PLO ever did. Think about the fact that when Hamas originally emerged, many in Israel thought it might be useful as a strategic balancing act to the PLO, and it ends up causing, again, issues that had never been previously considered. Osama bin Laden originally went to Afghanistan as part of the American and Saudi support of the jihadists. He was one of the good guys. And again, Americans are, oh, we don't have to worry about this small group of irrelevant Islamists. They're just useful in defeating the Soviet Union. So we need to be very, very careful in only looking at these things one move ahead. And just to maybe for the point of disagreement, because Dror and I have been completely agreeing with each other until this point, don't forget the weird subtleties that can develop. When Israel killed the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, a few weeks ago, it was wildly celebrated all over Syria. Not because they're friends of Israel, but because Hezbollah were the mortal enemy of the Sunni community. Because how did Assad survive the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011? He brutalized the Syrian people, up to 500,000 killed, largely by having Hezbollah come in from Lebanon and act as his army. So Hezbollah are despised. But obviously there's dichotomies here. The other day we had, on the same day, a rebel in one of the Islamic groups go on Israeli television saying he loves Israel, while other ones were filmed outside a mosque chanting, we're going to march to Jerusalem and liberate the Holy Land. So absolutely, this is a country which historically has been trained to hate Israel. But at the same time, Syrians want prosperity. Syrians want to not be in the kind of country they have been in for the last 54 years. And that can produce surprising outcomes. If 50 odd years ago we'd have told you that Anwar Sadat, who'd just attacked Israel, and posed a threat to Israel that no other war had ever posed to the Israeli state. That he, a few years ago, would stand up in the Egyptian parliament and then a few months later would be standing in the Knesset, and that Israel would give him a piece of land 2.5 times the size of Israel to make peace with him, putting the Egyptian army right back on the Israeli border. You'd have led me away in a white coat and called me insane. Yes, that is exactly what happened.
Well, one of the other countries that has had a very changed position as a result of this is Turkey. What does this mean for Turkey's influence and particularly for the Turkish-Syrian border?
The Turkian role in this wild Syrian arena is quite unique. First, Turkey, or Erdogan, we must remember, is an Islamist leader. He's a Muslim Brotherhood ideological leader ruling a Turkish state. His vision is to promote the idea of Islam. It's not in the way Al-Qaeda or ISIS, Daesh used to do, but in the Muslim Brotherhood way of conquering the hearts and recruiting the people through good intentions and so on. So when Assad, together with Iran and Hezbollah, the Shiite, were fighting the Sunnis, Erdogan had one thing to do, and that to join the other side, to join the Sunnis, support the Sunnis, and he supported groups from a very wide spectrum, coming from Muslim Brotherhood all the way to practically Al-Qaeda and Daesh, ISIS. Everybody crossed through the Turkish border. Everybody were trained in Turkish camps, and that was the reality on the ground. Right now, Erdogan is having a blast. He's practically took one major step in his vision of bringing back Turkey to its historical and victorious position as the Ottoman Emperor. That's part of his vision, reviving the vision of the Ottoman Emperor. That's a long-term vision, and today is one step closer to doing that. At the same time, he has a national security issue in Syria called the Kurds. The Kurds in Syria are the broadening arms of the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurds in Iraq. Those represent a major domestic threat to Turkey, and they are considered terrorists. And this is why the Turkish military penetrated Syria a few years ago in order to prevent the American-supported Kurds from establishing a political entity on the border of Turkey. So there is a clash between the Turkish visions and the American forces that support the Kurds on the ground. So Turkey is in a very sensitive situation. Yes, it had its win, but at the same time, it needs to work very closely to not step on the toes of the Americans who are still supporting the Kurds, who are still fighting against ISIS, Daesh, which is still present in Syria. Nobody wants to see another rise of the Islamic State on account of Turkish meddling in Syria, as it did in the last couple of weeks or months. And I think Turkey is in a very sensitive situation. It, again, going to the very interesting notion of unintentional outcomes, Erdogan might find himself in a situation that he released a genie he didn't intend in Syria, and that could be a major source of conflict between Erdogan and the Americans.
Yeah, and this Ottomanization dynamic is very important. 20 years ago, Turkey thought they were about to be invited to join the European Union. But what already had been happening was that post 9/11 and post London and Madrid attacks in Europe, the European leaders moved away from that. And when Turkey realized it was not going to be invited to join Europe, in other words, that it wasn't a Western country to the north, it very much reverted back to being a Middle Eastern country. And if you think about the power of the Ottoman Empire, it was that circle around the Mediterranean, from modern day Lebanon and Syria right through North Africa to Libya. This is one of the reasons why Turkey has been very involved in the ongoing dynamics in Libya. It's one of the reasons why there's been a lot of tensions between Russia and Turkey because of their natural, which created a very natural competition between the two of them. But also remember that Turkey is in a very unusual and weak strategic position. That looking north, they can see the Ukraine war with binoculars, while looking south, they've got the chaos of Syria directly on their border. And as we've both been alluding to, the idea of a Kurdish state is seen as the great existential threat to Turkey. If you think of the map I showed earlier, the purple on the right of the map in Iraq has been a semi-autonomous Kurdish entity in Iraq since the Gulf War in 1990, 1991. We then got next to it the Syrians taking a part of Syria. And Turkey has been very worried that either one of them might declare independence, but worst of all, they might join together as a single entity, and there would now be a Kurdish state on the entire southern Turkish border. I remind you that a few years ago in Iraq, the Kurds held a referendum. It was opposed by the Iraqi government, but they had a referendum. 90% of their people voted for independence, and these are the Kurdish Iraqi leaders. This is Kurdish Iraq, not Kurdish Syria. They said, we're not going to declare independence, but it's the will of our people, and we reserve the right to do so at any point in the future. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, what we now should watch in the next few weeks is that Turkey's interest in Syria, its number one interest, is not what happens in Damascus. It's going to be to defeat the Kurds and take the areas in the northeast. And they've already taken two of the major centers that they control. Now, as Dror says, this is complicated because their backers are the United States, Turkey's NATO ally, right? But Turkey's acting its national interest, and it doesn't especially care if that is uncomfortable for the United States of America. Where this creates interesting issues for Israel is we're all talking about whether, Al Qaeda running Syria is a nightmare. I think a secondary question that is being considered in a very high level in Israeli strategic thinking today is, well, what happens if actually something different happens? That Turkey is run by a less radical entity, but in effect run by Turkey and a Turkish ally. Erdogan is very, very unhappy with the Israelis at the moment, and a hugely Turkish allied Syria poses different but equally complicated challenges for Israel as a Syria run by jihadists.
3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and some of them have begun to return since the weekend. Are we going to see a massive return of people to Syria, do you think? And does Turkey want to make this happen?
Turkey desperately wants to make it happen. It's got literally millions and millions of Syrians in their country. The position that Turkey, Jordan, and a number of countries have taken is we're holding these people, but at some point they've got to go back. And we've already seen thousands of people joyfully return to Syria, but of course many, many others, and this is even more the case for the huge numbers in Europe. They're going to wait to see whether things stabilize or not. They're acutely aware that when Mubarak fell, when Ben Ali fell, when Gaddafi fell in 2010, 2011, everyone's like, wonderful, the world's going to be great again. And of course, that is not what transpired on the ground in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, etc. So I don't think we're going to see an immediate return of millions, but we're certainly going to see, we're already seeing it, a return of thousands and thousands. And undoubtedly, Turkey's policy is going to be, thanks very much, time to go home. And this is also an issue for the Jordanians, well over 1 million of them in Jordan, a country always very delicately balanced. But this is also a massive issue here in Europe, where the migration crisis, which has so undermined the mainstream politics of Europe, has been driven largely by Iraqi, Syrian, and Afghan refugees in the last few years. If Britain has already suspended asylum claims for Syrians on the grounds that, well, you've now got a country that maybe doesn't need asylum. So I think it potentially solves a lot of these migration and human issues, both in the region and the world. But understandably, Syrians are going to wait to see whether this is a false dawn or a true reality before they start flocking back to the country.
And if they do, will they bring a more secular, having lived in Europe and even in Turkey, bring a more secular and possibly even more democratic understanding of the kind of world they want to live in?
I find it hard to believe.
They said that about Assad, and that didn't turn out so well, did it?
It takes a lot of time to change cultural tendencies, I think the Syrian refugees in Europe didn't experience a very liberal hug from the local population. There is a lot of resentment. And if they go back to Syria, which is yet to be seen, we need to remember Syria is a devastating situation. The World Bank assessed that in order to rebuild Syria, somebody needs to pay something like $20 billion in order to rebuild the country after 15 years of civil war. There is practically not much to go back to. And I think the refugees in Europe are going to be in a wait and see position. And yes, some will come back from Turkey, of course, because Turkey is going to push them, but nobody is going to push refugees from Syria, from Europe back to Damascus. That's not going to happen. And unless there will be a significant improvement in the quality of life in Syria, I don't really see people leaving Europe going back to the Middle East.
And what about the involvement of other Sunni states, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf? Where do we see them fitting into this?
Well, I think this is one of the key issues is, as George just mentioned, it's going to cost at least 200 billion to rebuild Syria, something that's a gross underestimate. I mentioned before, up to three-quarters of the population dispersed, three-quarters of the buildings destroyed. This is going to be a generational project of the kind we haven't seen since the reconstruction of Germany and Japan after World War II. The problem is who's going to pay for it in the current international environment? European and Western governments are already falling to the far right because they're not solving their current economic issues. They're not addressing the economic needs of their populations. And any spare money, any spare national treasure is, of course, going to Ukraine because of the recognition that if Ukraine loses, then that creates a potential global security threat of the kind that we haven't seen since the rise of Hitler. So the idea that somehow, the Americans and the Europeans are going to sit down next week and magically find billions of dollars to rebuild Syria. But part of your question, I think, is the key, and that is the Gulf states. What I am hoping, I'll be honest, I'm not hopeful, but I'm hoping because they have a poor track record of this. But what we need is the Gulf states to step up. We need the Saudis, the UAEs, and others to recognize their vested interest in the rebuilding of Syria. And if they do it, by the way, they're very well suited to doing it. The UAE, and particularly now Saudi Arabia with its reforms, the Vision 2030 reforms, it's all about infrastructure. It's all about project development. It's all about building. And it actually would really help augment their economy if they were able to basically, through obviously large international support as well, basically rebuild Syria. The problem, as we've talked about with Libya, with Egypt, with Tunisia, is that Syrians will have patience, but not for very long. And if they realize their country isn't being rebuilt, if they realize that it's just going to be a desperately horrible place just with different new leaders, we're very quickly going to go back to issues of resentment. And that plays into the hands of the return of the Al-Qaeda's, the Islamic states, whatever we're calling the next iteration of them, to emerge. And the international community, as well as the Gulf states, need to recognize that. Linking this in with your past question, by the way, one of the big concerns if Turkey takes the Kurdish areas is that the Kurds are currently running prisons full of some of the worst mass murderers of Islamic State. And there's a real concern, and many of them are, British, French, Singaporean, Tunisian, Algerian, they're from all over the world. The concern is that if these people come out, they're not just going to re-radicalize Syria, but they're going to pose a terrorism threat in other places in the world. So creating stability in Syria should be a global international priority, but it's not going to be because nobody can afford to pay for it. And that is one of the reasons why Israel's taken out the Syrian military, because there is no optimism at all in Jerusalem, understandably, that there's going to be any real ability to return Syria to being a comfortable, stable, self-managing state anytime soon.
And it doesn't sound as if there is any group there that has the capacity to run a state as opposed to be a military group, that we're in danger of seeing the kind of thing we've seen with Hamas and the PA too, where the transition from being a revolutionary group to actually running a country, the capacity is just not there.
We should remember again that the HTS has run practically an entity of 2-3 million people in the area of Idlib for the last 5 years. And they did it the way Muslim Brotherhood, Salafites, Al-Qaeda affiliated groups do, with radical Islam, very low attention to civil rights and liberties and so on. This is the model that they're already used to, and they have implemented that for 5 years. Most chances that this is what's going to come up in Syria. Any other option will be a major positive surprise from the intelligence point of view.
Well, one change that we do have on the horizon, of course, is that Trump is about to take office in the US. He's been elected with an isolationist policy. Is there any likelihood that what's happened in the Middle East will affect that?
To the wrong decision, to the wrong. I think if the complexity of the Syrian arena is only going to push the American administration under Trump and Trump personally further away. If you remember, we referred to the Middle East as this hellhole of sand and nothing. And I think Syria pretty much represents that very good today. And to one point that Hagai mentioned earlier, the possibility of the Gulf states, the Emirates, the Saudis, and Bahrain pouring money into Syria under HTS, Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist kind of regime is very low. We should remember that Al-Qaeda, Salafites, Muslim Brotherhood reject the idea of monarchies. They reject the Saudis. They reject the Emiratis. They reject the kingdom, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. These are the exactly opposite political spectrum of Islam. Moderate, Western kind of Islam and radical Salafite kind of Islam are now going to help each other. I don't really see that happen. And I think the risk, the immediate risk, is not for the Saudis. I don't think the guys from the mosque in Damascus are going to march to Saudi Arabia. But for sure, there is a risk for the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Jordan has a very problematic internal domestic Islamist challenge with a shockwave coming from Syria with the moral support, not even military, just the moral support and the domino effect that can evolve from a Muslim Brotherhood Islamist regime in Damascus. That could have catastrophic effect on the domestic challenge in Jordan, and that could have very significant challenge from Israel's point of view, because Jordan has the longest land border with Israel. The Jordanian stability is maybe the #1 strategic interest of Israel when it comes to the surrounding countries. And Israel is going to follow very closely, I'm sure, the events in Jordan. We already hear coordination between Israel, Jordan, and the US regarding maintaining the stability, opening a very watchful eyes on the Salafite, Muslim Brotherhood, and other Islamists in Jordan, making sure that the shockwaves from Syria won't topple the kingdom of Jordan as well.
Yeah, just to give context on Dror's point about the thing about the Muslim Brotherhood and the concern about Islamism, remember that the Saudis and the UAE, very much with Egypt and others part of it, led for years a boycott of Qatar. And while publicly that was about Iran, if you read the demands, part of it was there were two things. Part of it was to try and force Qatar to disengage with Iran, but the other was to force Qatar to disengage from Islamism. Remember that Qatar at the time they had the only Taliban embassy in the world. It's actually where the Americans and the Taliban for 8 years secretly negotiated the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. They have moderated Qatar every single Israel-Hamas ceasefire, and of course have been the moderator in the last year and with the hostages. They were the ones who put all the money into the Egyptian central bank when the Muslim Brotherhood was elected, and then pulled all that money out when Sisi overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood, trying to stop Qatar bolstering the Muslim Brotherhood and relatively moderate, but certainly less moderate Islamism over the Middle East was so serious for the Gulf states that they were willing to, in effect, go to economic war against one of their own in order to stop that happening. So this is very important. To the question about Trump, I want to remind you of the weird Trump agenda, which is going to have a massive impact on the Middle East. He has spent the entire election saying, I'm going to bring peace. Now, what that has already become clear is that he's basically going to kind of uncomfortably impose solutions on people, most importantly, his own allies. And one of the things he's done for Ukraine, for example, is he's told them already that they're going to give Russia part of the country, and in return, Trump will make Putin withdraw. Over the last few days, the Americans have been incredibly hardly lobbying the Qataris to not just get this hostage deal done, but to get a full ceasefire in Gaza before Trump comes to office. He is already claiming credit for the Lebanon ceasefire. But interestingly, he completely 100% agrees with Netanyahu and Israel about the threat that Iran poses. And he possibly is going to allow the Israelis to take out Iran's capability. So we are going to have some weird policies with Donald Trump. But you'll notice that in everything I just said, I didn't once say the word Syria. And that's to Dror's point. It's too complicated for American policymakers. It's certainly too complicated for the Trump administration. And they will get involved in it when it hurts American interests. But the last US soldiers currently in Syria, will be withdrawn. And I doubt very much, if we're looking for nuanced policy in Syria, that we're going to find it in the administration of Donald Trump.
I'm not sure that we're going to find nuanced policy in the administration of Benjamin Netanyahu either, but there's a question here. Do you think that by Israel helping with medical aid, it could get involved in Syria in a way which would be a good PR exercise and perhaps place Israel in a different way of being seen by Arab countries?
Well, actually,
I mean, Israel's done it before. It used to go into Turkey quite a lot during earthquakes and things. We even had Israel sending aircraft with aid to Indonesia when we had the earthquakes and things, as a way of kind of soft diplomacy. But the minute, of course, we've had, Israel attacking Gaza after October 7, look how vociferously anti-Israel those countries have returned to being, when the political reality very quickly overtakes the limited humanitarian assistance. So, look, I think it's certainly an area where Israel has the ability to go into places in a way that they can't politically. But I'm guessing from the smile on Dror's face that he's as cynical as I am as to whether that's a place that Israel's going to have influence in Syria in the short and medium term.
The truth is that there is a precedent. Israel played a positive role in Syria along the Golan Heights during 2014, 2015. 2016, Israel established very good connection with the local population, evacuating injured into Israeli hospitals, providing food, humanitarian assistance, in order to create a very instrumental thing from the Israeli point of view, security-wise, a buffer zone of Sunni rebels that would prevent the Iranians from reaching all the way to the Israeli border. Some of the groups that Israel was interacting with along the Golan Heights in the past are now part of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, all kind of radical, again, it's a spectrum of radical Islamists were in contact with Israel. Some of them were treated in Israeli hospitals. So yes, there is a bud of maybe positive sentiment among some of the population along the Israeli Syrian border in the Golan Heights. Whether that can evolve to a larger national sentiment, that's a great challenge. And again, I'm skeptic, because the root identity of the Syrians over the past 50 years was that Israel is the enemy. The Islamic deep ideological tendency of the overall Syrian population is not one that is a fertile ground for a peaceful relationship with Israel. Again, the sites in Gaza doesn't really help in that aspect. And I think it's going to be a very tactical, positive connections along the border, maybe, but on the national level, I think Syria, again, assuming the HTS is going to be running the show, is going to be a very tense, sensitive, a lot of suspicious is going to be in the air.
And by the way, we haven't spoken about it yet, but the Druze context, Druze, is very important. Remember that we have in the Golan Heights Israelis who are also Syrian and who have to balance both of those things. And a lot of what Israel has done in Syria, including the example that Dror has given, was to ensure that the Druze community in the Golan Heights was kept happy by Israel coming to the aid of them, in addition to the Sunnis that Dror mentions in Syria. And I think a lot of what Israel is going to be doing, it's part of what they're doing now with their intervention in the buffer zone, is to try and make sure that the Druze community in Syria does not become victimized in this situation, because that becomes a real domestic problem inside Israel. And certainly, if we're looking for actors within Syria who have a long positive relationship with Israel, the Druze community, to some extent, are that. There are other groups that we've mentioned who are, that Dror's mentioned as well. But yeah, that's different from whether that is going to affect, the Syrian government at a national level. Deborah, you still with us?
Yeah, Deborah, you're on mute for some reason. We can't really hear you.
Okay, I tried switching my mic in the hope that it would help, but it seems to have made things worse. So I'm back on this mic. We are out of time. We didn't think that we would be able to cover it all, and we certainly haven't been able to, but we have learned a great deal. We are very grateful to you both for giving us the time and the benefit of your knowledge. As we all follow with great interest what is going to happen in Syria. This event will be available on YouTube. So I know that we did receive messages from a number of people saying they weren't able to listen to it live, but if you know people who want to hear it, they will be able to access it, the recording afterwards. And of course, we will continue to cover the issues on the Jewish independence. So if you don't already, please subscribe and follow us on all these social platforms. Thank you all very much and good night.